there are individual differences in cognition and this idea of gender differences in skills and ability. This is even more controversial, I guess you could say, or emotionally tinged than the very idea of broad differences, gender differences in cognition. So how might we ever observe that? Well, it could be documented through a narrative review. In other words, you look up studies and you have an informal way of observing that there are differences between the two major groups. That's possible. It's sort of an informal tallying. Now, more narrowly, there's vote counting or tabulating the results of studies. So, 14 studies showed this, 10 studies showed no difference between the genders. I've done that with my cancer treatment. I found 10 studies that say something is effective and another 5 that say it's not. I'm going to go with the 10 that say is effective and just take my chances. They could be wrong, but you got to start somewhere. Then there's a more formal process that's been since the mid-70s called a meta-analysis, which tabulates the results of studies and assigns them an effect size. Basically get a unitless indicant of how powerful differences are between the genders, if there are differences between the two major genders that your author describes. So number 3 is sort of the Cadillac of these things. Whenever you can invoke numbers and tabulate effect sizes across many studies, that is considered to be something that is the most valuable contribution to get a take-home message. And we'll talk a little bit about that idea of effect size here in a minute. So, for example, verbal abilities. Females are better than males on some tests. About 3/4 of studies have shown that. So that's somewhat interesting. 27% of those had what they call statistical significance. In other words, they reject the idea broadly that the data could have been observed by chance. That I've got samples of men and women that perform differently on a task, but it's likely to be by chance. That once we have statistical significance, we rule out that idea of chance and basically assume, although we could be wrong, that there is a real difference. And that's what statistical significance alludes to. Now, only 27% of those studies had that statistical significance. The effect size is smallish. They're generally under 0.3 and often under 0.2, but 0.5 is considered to be a medium effect size, so 0.3 is even smaller. And those differences are pretty old. They're found in studies published before 73. Now, anyway, I'm comfortable in conceding that there may be some reliable difference, that females are better than males on some tests of verbal abilities. For instance, at early ages, it appears to be the case that middle school age females are better at phonemes. They're better at breaking words down into their component parts. So in that case, I think there's very plausible evidence for that. And I think it probably has a pretty decent effect size. So is there any real harm in conceding that? I don't think so. I think it's okay if there's a reliable difference that comes through decade after decade, that there may be some germ of truth to it. I don't think we have to insist that everything's equal, but that's my opinion. I'm working on getting myself fired here, so I better be careful. Okay, visual spatial abilities. Mental rotation. Now, for whatever reason, you can take this with a grain of salt or look into it. There is some indication that boys outperform girls or men outperform women. The difference is primarily in speed and not accuracy. So the role of the participant is to determine if the figure remains the same as it floats through space. So if I start over on the left, are the left and the second from left figure the same? And they are. What about the third figure over? Hey, brother. I think it is. Yeah. I don't know now. No, maybe not. Okay, I'm butchering it. I'm sorry, everybody. I told you I was 54. And is the fourth figure on the far right the same as the one on the left? No, I don't think it is. So your job is to make that determination, whether the figures, the three right figures, match the one on the left. And as the faster you do it, the greater suggestion of a visuospatial ability. I'm sorry I butchered that. I guess I'm under pressure making the recording. And the difference is primarily in speed, and men have shown a slight speed advantage. But it also may be the case that men, for whatever reason, are said to be more lateralized. In other words, their spatial hemisphere, where they do this stuff, is more heavily concentrated on the right hemisphere, and maybe they have an advantage doing that sort of thing. That's possible. But for what it's worth. Now, interestingly, there's a little wrinkle here that, and this is a graph from your text, that on the top two tasks, let's say the aerial maps task and the mental rotation task, the blue is males, the white is females, that it looks to be the case as SES goes up, socioeconomic status, bigger differences favoring males on spatial tasks emerge. Whereas at the lower SES, it appears to be pretty equal. And why is that? Well, at the higher socioeconomic statuses, there's more overt training and development of skills in males at the higher SES levels is the idea. And so therefore there's a more pronounced difference between boys and girls on those spatial tasks. For what it's worth. So one would ask, well, geez, is there any practical implication of these things? Does it mean somebody's going to land a higher paying job, etc.? Well, it may be the case that patterns of education are effective. So for instance, here are some suggestions dating to the 70s, as you can see, 72 through 79, in which boys had an advantage on SAT math sections, in which they appeared to outperform girls. And this predicted more educational degrees in math for males, for what it's worth. So there may be different patterns of choosing different fields based on early encouragement, and some would say maybe it's real ability. It's a hard call. But I think, again, this dates to the 70s, so 79 was now 45 years ago. You could say that these patterns have leveled off since then, although the number of math students and engineering students at MIT, for example, is still heavily male. So one can ask themselves, is there some real prejudice that has rooted itself? And that's plausibly true. In fact, we'll talk about that here in a second. Are there different treatments for boys and girls? So in general, this is a take-home message. In general performance, R squared equals 0.01 to 0.05 on variance and tasks accounted for by gender. It's a small fraction. In other words, if you take spatial ability or verbal ability or anything where gender might play a role, about 1% to 5% of that pie chart is accounted for by gender. And between 95 and 99% are other things. So you could argue that there are some pronounced trends. It appears to be the case that if there was a whole world full of Tetris playing, if you know what Tetris is, that spatial game, then maybe males would dominate. And on the other hand, if there were a whole world full of resolving phonemes as part of words, then maybe females would dominate. But in all the other tasks, there's a lot of equivalence. Now, what may predict some separation, encouragement or nurturing or what have you, as people grew up. So it's a loaded topic. It's got some emotion attached to it, but I am not afraid of admitting that there may be trace differences or some significant differences on a narrow handful of tasks. It just doesn't bother me. I don't think that's misogyny to assume that young females are better at reading or that the young boys are better at a Tetris type game. I think we can live with that. But you may have your own opinions and think that it's all hogwash, that there really are no fundamental differences. By the way, your author cites Hyde many times, Hyde. She has, in recent years, maybe 15 years, become Shibley Hyde. And she is the nation's leading researcher on these things. I just happened to see a talk from her about 15 years ago in Jacksonville. It was 2011. I guess that was 13 years ago. And she basically reached the conclusion that there are differences on some tasks that appear to be pretty immutable, but nonetheless, they don't have much practical import. And that would be my assumption also, but I'm giving you a lot of opinions here, so I better be quiet.